Welcome to the UN Brief. Today we have the press conference excerpts from the UN Special Rapporteur on Climate Change in the context of human rights, Mr. Jan Fry, his first press conference and his first report to the UN Human Rights Council. Thank you for watching the UN Brief and don't forget to subscribe.
The devastating effects of climate change are having serious implications throughout the world. Just in March this year, in South Asia, there were record high temperatures, the highest temperatures ever recorded in history. However, these costs are not being met by the international community and are being primarily ignored. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change clearly shows that climate change is upon us and we have to do something about it. The critical issue that I've reported in my report is that I've identified 6 key issues that I want to deal with. The first is around the elements of how climate change is being addressed, looking at the mitigation, adaptation, and particularly giving emphasis to loss and damage, because this is a critical area that seems to be being ignored. I also want to look at the issue of climate change displacement. There's a huge number of people, a sort of an intolerable tide of people moving as a consequence of climate change. In 2021, there were 59 million people internally displaced as a consequence of a variety of measures, but primarily as a result of climate-related events. So this is an enormous number of people, and this is higher than the number of people displaced as a consequence of conflict. The other issues I want to look at are particularly around looking at legislation and litigation, climate change cases, and particularly the issue of intergenerational justice. For our young people who now have an uncertain future, we want to guarantee their future. I also want to look at the issue of just transition for people who are working in the fossil fuel industry, how they can move safely from that industry to new greener technologies. I want to look at the new technologies that are being used, potentially used to address climate change, like geoengineering and other measures. So they're the sort of key steps that I want to look at. And I certainly particularly are concerned about this issue of people displaced across international borders. They're not defined as refugees under the Refugee Convention and therefore fall through the cracks as far as legal protection is concerned. You know, the people's right to food, to shelter, to access to water, the rights of women are all being affected as a consequence of climate change, and particularly, temperature increases. The right to life, basically, where lives are being lost as a consequence of climate change. 87 countries respond to my presentation yesterday in the Human Rights Council, and the vast majority of those were supportive of the position, almost unanimous support for my position. So there is a clear realisation of the connection between human rights issues and climate change. Well, I've had a number of sort of bilateral meetings with some countries, and they're obviously concerned. I think this is only early days as far as making the linkage between human rights and climate change. You know, I've had a long history of climate change negotiations, and the connection with human rights hasn't been all that strong. And I think countries are starting to realise this connection between human rights and the climate change agenda. And so they're starting to realise that they're going to have to do something about it. Of course, there are countries who are already feeling the impacts of climate change. You know, I was approached by some sub-Saharan African countries, expressing to me their concerns about the human rights impacts on their country as a consequence of climate change, and encouraging me to do more about it. I think some of the more advanced developed countries are starting to realise a strong connection, from their own personal experiences of the heat waves that have been around in recent times, and the need to make that link between human rights and the climate change agenda. A number of special rapporteurs have looked at the issue of climate change, and I've had good discussions with them. I met with the special rapporteur on violence against women recently to discuss her next report, which will be looking at climate change and violence against women. There are clear connections there, particularly with women who are displaced from their homes as a consequence of climate change and put in vulnerable situations. So I'm working very closely with a number of rapporteurs. We've had exchange of views on a number of issues around the connections, and we'll certainly be coordinating our work. These sort of new technologies cover a sort of broad range of technologies. Certainly, direct air injection, changing in brightening of the cloud brightening, could impact people as far as food production is concerned, depending on where it's taken place. There are also issues around what's called bioenergy and carbon capture and storage. So this is where the burning of wood products to produce electricity is being considered and being developed as an alternative to the use of coal-fired power stations. But the sourcing of that wood products is a serious concern for some people. Certainly, I've had discussions with Sami people in the Nordic regions, and they're concerned about their land being taken over by wood plantations for this bioenergy production. There are some countries in Africa where timber is being sourced for fuel wood production, going into these wood-fired power plants. So there's a variety of issues. In the Pacific, we've looked at the issue of iron filings being put into the ocean to increase the absorption of carbon dioxide, and there are potential impacts for fisheries and hence human rights implications as a result of that.
We have a question in the chat from our colleague Bodhi Hugger, who represents Phoenix TV. He asks, the government and courts, I think he means governments in general, and courts are not so far active in environmental laws, and they don't include an expression of environmental rights. Do you have any comments to this statement?
Well, there are a number of court cases being held around the world. There was a recent case in the Netherlands last year. So there are a number of cases being held, questioning the role of governments in setting targets for climate change. There are, court cases against companies. So there's a variety of litigation that's before the courts at the moment. And one of the critical issues that I want to look at is access to courts. I've met with youth and groups who are concerned that they don't get access to courts in some jurisdictions, and I certainly want to look at that, because the critical issue is the voice of youth is critical to be heard in these sorts of court cases. I think there are some areas where there are linkages, and that links to this issue of new technologies as well, I guess. If we do overshoot the 1.5 degrees Celsius target that's been set in the Paris Agreement, and the impacts increase, there may have to be, some drastic measures taken to reduce the global temperature, and that's around some of these technology fixes, atmospheric technology fixes. So the challenge is that, are the human rights impacts of climate change greater than the human rights impacts of these technologies? And this is a critical issue that I will want to look at as part of my mandate. I don't have an easy answer for that. I had some dialogue with an expert yesterday on this issue, and it is a challenging issue for the world to think about. Are these new technologies and their impacts going to be more significant than the overall impacts of climate change? So I'm certainly be looking at that issue. Well, to first answer your first question, I guess, is the linkages with other UN agencies. Certainly, I'll be having dialogue with the UN refugee on refugees. I've already, made contact with UN Women, the UN Convention on Desertification. I've had meetings with them and United Nations Environment Programme. So I'll be reaching out to a number of UN agencies around these issues. And of course, the High Commission for Refugees is a critical part of that. With regard to the sort of, particular issues that I want to focus on, clearly the fossil fuel industry itself is the major producer of greenhouse gases. So that's clearly a focus of where I want to look at and how to look at the connections of what they're doing on human rights. And certainly that will connect with work, looking at legislation, looking at litigation, and corporate responsibility is what I want to, another key issue I want to deal with. So this is where businesses, financial institutions are investing in the fossil fuel industry, and so I want to pursue the issue of disclosure around disclosing the investments in fossil fuel industry and businesses that are disclosing their risks to the impacts of climate change. So this is another critical area that I want to focus on. We had bilateral meetings with India and Japan, and they were very good discussions. And I think they understand the critical importance of my new role, and so that's important. I worked very well with colleagues from the Russian Federation during climate change negotiations, and I think it's just a matter of them understanding this issue a bit more, that they'll come on board to this issue. The issue is, how will I work with a special rapporteur on the rights to clean environment, clean, safe and environment? Well, I've certainly had a dialogue with them. Previously, he's covered the sort of issue of climate change. So we'll work out where our respective roles will fit into this place. The critical issue immediately for that is, there was a resolution last year in the Human Rights Council on the rights of a safe, clean environment and healthy environment, and that's now currently before the UN General Assembly, and I've been offering my support to the Special Rapporteur to support that resolution before the UN General Assembly.
Thank you for watching the UN Brief, and don't forget to subscribe.